Hey, good morning. We are on Lamed Daled Amud Beis 34b. We're about 4 lines from the top of the page. So, having discussed the entering the land of Eretz Yisrael successfully under Yeshua, and the Gemara earlier juxtaposed that against the mistaken or those who tried to sabotage the entry into the land of Eretz Yisrael, the spies. Now the Gemara comments on that narrative and the story of the spies. So the spies, of course, just to overview, before the Jewish people are to enter the land of Eretz Yisrael under Moshe Rabbeinu, the beginning of their journey in the desert, which wasn't supposed to be so long. They were just there for 49 days, got the Torah. In theory, that could have been the end of the story, but they messed up. So they got the Torah a second time, got the 10 Commandments a second time. They built the Mishkan as per God's instruction. And then they're supposed to enter the land of Israel. That's supposed to be the end of the story. As we're going to learn, Moshe Rabbeinu decides to send spies to scout the land. And on the most basic level, Moshe Rabbeinu instructs them only to discover what's the best way to conquer the land. Whereas they take it upon themselves to make a decision on whether they should conquer the land. That wasn't their instruction. Their instruction was just discover how to conquer. But they decide to make a decision on whether they should or should not, and come back saying, no, we should not. As a result, the Jews wandered the desert for 40 years until that generation has completely passed on, including Moshe Rabbeinu. And then the Jewish people enter under Joshua, as we learned earlier with the crossing of the river. So this is this context of the story. So the story begins with the following words, 4 lines at the top. Shlach lecha nashim. God says, send for you, people. Here's the interesting phrase. It should have just said, send people. Shlach anashim. Why shlach lecha? Send for you, people. Amar Shlakish says the famous words, Rashi quotes it in Chumash. Shlach lecha, send for you. Mitaitcha, on your own. Hashem says, you make the call. So Moshe Rabbeinu asks Hashem, should we send spies? And Moshe Rabbeinu says, look, I'm not commanding. God says, I'm not going to command you. You make the call. You decide. So Moshe Rabbeinu decides, yes. And as Shlakish puts it, would a person even willfully choose something that's going to be negative for themselves? Obviously not. So surely then God would not command to do something that's ultimately going to be negative. That's how Rashi phrases it. Would Hashem command Moshe Rabbeinu to do something that's ultimately going to be negative for Moshe Rabbeinu or for himself, for God? So we must therefore conclude that it was Moshe Rabbeinu's decision on his own. Behind the ksiv, and this is the meaning of the verse, which says, Vayita ve'enai hadavar. Moshe Rabbeinu says, this idea of sending spies seemed good in my eyes. And therefore we selected 12 people and sent them. So Amar Shlakish again further comments on this verse, ve'enai. It seemed good to me to send spies, but not in the eyes of the omnipresent, not in the eyes of God. Now, here's something that is very, very empowering. If Hashem says, well, let's put it this way. Okay, so Shlakish says that God wouldn't instruct to do something that he knows that would be negative. So why wouldn't God just say, don't send, it's a bad idea? But Hashem acquiesced to Moshe Rabbeinu and say, you decide, you make the call. And then why wouldn't Moshe Rabbeinu himself figure out if God's not commanding me directly and telling me I should figure it out? Maybe it's because God knows this is not a good idea. So why would Moshe Rabbeinu go ahead with it? If Hashem doesn't explicitly tell him, send spies, would he not figure out something amiss? So therefore, it would seem, this is an idea you can find throughout Chassidus when it discusses the story, which is, as the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, which we explained a number of times, is the Jewish people leaving the spiritual cocoon and bubble of the desert and going into Eretz Yisrael, where they have to work the land. They have to make a home for Hashem in this world. They got to do the work on their own. They can't be riding the coattails of the spirituality that God provides, the manna from heaven, the clouds of glory, communication directly to Hashem from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's time to roll up your sleeves and do it on your own. Get into the land, work for your own food, and do so by Hashem wants. Fight your battles, Hashem will back you, and Hashem will make you win, but you got to fight the battles. You got to work the land. So if the entire objective is that man do the work from bottom up, so when Hashem says, you figure it out, this is exactly the point. And Moshe Rabbeinu understood this. It's time to mature up. It's time to make decisions on your own. So Hashem says, look, you're going to the land of Israel, where you're going to leave the comfort zone of what I provide. You got to make decisions on your own. And therefore you decide on your own whether you want to send in spies. Which means then that what the message Hashem is sending Moshe Rabbeinu is, I know it's risky. I know they might mess up, but I'm giving them the choice anyway. You make the call. So Moshe goes ahead with it. He trusts the people and sends spies, knowing full well that in Hashem telling him, you decide, there is a high probability that they might mess up. Which is a very empowering thing, because what it tells you is that baked into the cake of Hashem saying, you serve me, is the knowledge Hashem has that you're likely to mess up. And it's the first thing the Jews do when they're told to do something on their own, is mess up. Never mind when they're in the desert, when they're being served by Hashem, the manna and taken care of, they also mess up there with kaidach, with the golden calf, complaining about the slav, the water. You know, when they're spoiled, they complain. That's how life is, right? We talked about this. When did we learn about this? We learned about it when we studied Yuma. Remember the quail? We learned about this in Yuma. Yes. When we studied Yuma last summer, the end of last chapter of Yuma, we discussed it then. The Jewish people are wandering the desert spoiled, and when you're spoiled, you complain. That's one thing. But here's another thing. The pasuk says, "Noida alila b'nei adam." Woe is to the schemes on man. And our sages interpret the verse to mean that woe unto man that Hashem sets him up in such a situation where he's likely to fail.
This could have been the introduction into free choice.
Exactly. It's the introduction to free choice.
And
Hashem is saying,
Hashem is probably will understand this well myself.
That's right. That's the point.
They wanted to back out of leaving Egypt. But that choice wasn't given to them.
That's right. Those who stay behind, stay behind. But once they left, that was it. You were yanked out of Egypt. You were thrown at the mountains hold over their head, right? They're being told that they have to take the Torah, and that's the end of it. So now that, like you said, now free choice begins. So it's important to remember that the fact that a Jew might on occasion fail, God forbid, shouldn't be seen as debilitating. That's it. It's over. I failed. It's done. Before you started, Hashem knew you're capable of failing. And Hashem trusted you anyway, knowing full well that you might fail here and there. Don't worry about it. March forward. It'll take you 40 years to get into the land. You'll still get into the land. So this is perhaps why it's specifically like this. Hashem says, you decide, because now it's time for free choice. And Moshe Rabbeinu has to weigh that risk on his own. Trust the people, which tells you another thing, the tzaddik. The trust that tzaddik has in the people. Tzaddik has this innate faith. A true leader has real faith in his people, even as they mess up. Moshe Rabbeinu knew them. He's seen them mess up many times, and still trusted them. It's the power of Moshe Rabbeinu to trust in the people. We'll see later that there has to be a symbiotic relationship. If the people turn back to Moshe Rabbeinu to ask him for strength, and that's when things work out, as we'll learn soon. But here we see the innate trust Hashem, the Moshe Rabbeinu has in the people, and sends them knowing that they might mess up. And they do. And they get yelled at for messing up. And there's negative consequences to their mess up. And Hashem still knows it and still gives us free choice. And still says, you decide on your own. Very, very powerful message. Hashem sends you on a mission, you got to decide on your own. Sometimes you'll mess up, and your free choice wasn't zapped away from you just because you messed up. Like the Gemara says elsewhere, that one of the things Hashem regrets is the creation of the Yetzer Hara. That's what the Gemara says. Hashem regrets a number of things, whatever that means. And one of the things is he regrets the Yetzer Hara. Regrets. So if you regret the creating the Yetzer Hara, snap your finger, be gone with it. So which means even while it's there, he regrets it. Meaning the project is such that we need to have a Yetzer Hara, which means there's going to be failures. And that itself Hashem regrets while it's there. Right? So while Hashem knows we're capable of messing up, he still wants that free choice. You choose. You decide whether to send the spies in. Even though Hashem is aware of the high possibility of a mess up.
Seems interesting. I'm not sure Ben's role in this particular juncture, because he ultimately had to make that choice.
That's right.
And I guess he must have had some sort of divination or
inclination on that they might fail.
Of the failure.
Maybe. I like to think that Moshe Rabbeinu has this innate trust in the Jewish people. And the mistake is the attitude of the spies, as we're going to see. So let's see, we're going to juxtapose those who messed up, the 10, versus Yeshua and Kalev, who did not mess up. And we're going to see that from Moshe Rabbeinu's end, he trusts them all, as we see. Hashem says, you decide. And he says, okay, I trust the people. They're going to do it right. But the people have a different attitude. So let's see. The verse says, when Moshe Rabbeinu tells the people what happened, right? At the end, Moshe Rabbeinu reviews the whole history before they enter the land of Israel. So he tells them that you guys came to me asking about sending people. God says, I decide. And I decided to send. Now here's how Moshe Rabbeinu phrases the people's request that they go to that they scout the land. It says like this: and we shall search the land. That's the word here for search is yachbaru. We shall search, or we shall scout. So Rabbi Abba says, from this phrasing, we can derive that Meraglim, the spies, only intended to embarrass the land. How so? Because it says here, the phrasing of the word to describe their desire to scout the land is vayachbaru. Let us scout out the land using that word yachbaru. And it says elsewhere in Isaiah, the sun, the moon will be ashamed, and the sun embarrassed. The verse goes on to say, because the presence of God is here. But what do we see? That the root word of ayachbaru, let's scout, comes from the word chafar, chasfei reish, which also means, as we see in this verse, embarrassment. Which means when they ask to scout the land, they use the terminology of, let's embarrass the land. The same word to describe two things: scout or embarrass. And the phrasing, the Torah's phrasing to tell us that when the spies asked to go scout, they use this word vayachbaru. There's other terms they could have used to say search the land, or to scout the land. They could have said laragil, which means to spy or to scout. Or how would you say to search? L'chapes, vayachbaru, or even loser asaretz, which which means to tour, to see around. But using this word vayachbaru, which means to seek out, to search, specifically this terminology, because it's the same root word as cherpa, which means to, or charfa halavan, actually, the fake putting before the resh, which means chafra halavana, which means to embarrass, indicating that from the beginning they wanted to embarrass. Now here's the key point. When faced with these challenges, the free choice kind of challenges, right? The story could have been they had good intention. They were going to go there and come back to the people and tell them, here's how we're going to get into the land of Israel. That could have been the story. But then they got to Israel and it was too overwhelming. So they came back and said, look, we really wanted this to work, but it's way too overwhelming. We can't do it. That could have been the narrative in theory, but it wasn't. That's the point the Gemara is telling us.
You may have had a preconception.
That's the point. That's exactly the point I'm going. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point I'm going to. In theory, the story could have been that they had a good intention, but they were met with too much opposition. So they came back and said it's too difficult. But the Gemara is telling us it's not the story. The Gemara is telling us when they went to seek out, they used this language of embarrassment, which means from the beginning they wanted to embarrass the land, which means it didn't matter what they would find in Israel. They already wanted it to be negative, teaching us that when you're faced with these challenges and free choices, the key here is your attitude before you start. If you start off with saying, I can't do it, then it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy and you won't be able to do it. But to begin with, as we're going to learn soon from Kalev and Yeshua, you seek out the strength of the tzaddik to give you encouragement and to give you their koyach, to give you their strength, as we're going to see soon from Yeshua and Kalev's attitude. Then you come back and you'll be unscathed. You'll overcome the challenge. But if to begin with the attitude is, no, it's a failure, we're not going to do it, it's not going to work, it's not going to work, we can't do it, then before you even hit the challenge, you've already failed. And of course the challenge is going to become overwhelming, because to begin with, you thought it was going to be overwhelming. But if to begin with, you make a decision that it's going to be good, and I'm going with the strength of the tzaddik who's giving me the shlichus, right? Moshe been sending him on a shlichus, then Moshe been sending him on a message. Go scout the land. So if they seek out the empowerment of the Moshe Rabbeinu, then indeed they'll be successful, as we're going to learn Yeshua and Kalev who did that. But the spies, to begin with, wanted the failure, so of course they failed. Right? The whole time they're relying on God, and now that they have to rely on their own, they say, before they even start, they say this is going to be embarrassing, it's not even worth it, let's not even try. Yeah.
This is the juxtaposition of the crossing the Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
They were up against a seemingly insurmountable task of moving these 40 stones individually.
Yeah.
That they didn't have a precondition that it was impossible to do. And were able to do it because they've already met the challenges from the past.
Right.
I think it was 40 years of contemplating mess up for the spies. I don't know, just looking at
that could also be the images. That could also be why the Aram was in front, indicating we're not afraid of the challenge because we're following Torah. We're not afraid of the challenge. There's a river. Good. So we put Torah in front and we cross the river. Then we're not worried about challenges. Whereas the spies were the other way. Before they even started, they already knew they already biased to assuming failure because they didn't want to face the challenge before they even started. Right? It's not as if like they faced a challenge and then it became overwhelming. It's almost always the case. When you find challenges overwhelming, I can't say all the time, but it's certainly very often that the reason why you find the challenge overwhelming is because before you started, you wanted it to be overwhelming. You already doubted yourself before you started. And that's why you find it challenging, not the other way around. It's often the case. Yeah. So further to that point, the Gemara tells us even more. That even in their names, as we're going to see, the names of the spies themselves are reflective of the fact that to begin with, they had a negative attitude. As you see, the verse says, these are the names of the spies. Mate Ruven, to the tribe, to the banner of Ruven, Shamua ben Zachor, a Jew named Samuel ben Zachar, and the verse goes on to list all of the various spies and their names for each tribe. Rabbi Yitzchak says, the following is a tradition we have from our forefathers. That meraglim, that all the spies, al shem maseim nikru, their names reflect their negative behavior and negative attitude. We have that by tradition, we know that. But for Anu and us, we try to look at all the names and see if we can find some sort of manner in which the name reflects negative. And also be adenu, we couldn't figure it out. Ella echad, only the following. Of all the names, we could only deduce from one of them a negative attitude to begin with. Namely, Sator ben Michael. Sasser ben Michael from the tribe of Asher. So with his name, we could figure out how his name is reflective of his negative. Yeah? So Sasser, why is it called Sator? Right? The word Sasser means to contradict, to conceal. He contradicted the actions of Hashem. Hashem says, I'm taking the land of Israel. And he says, no, we can't do it. So that's the word Sator. And Michal, he's Sator ben Michal, son of Michal. Sha'asa atzmei mach. He made himself weak. Namely, he made the whole scenario weak, and then no one can get, it's so difficult to earn a living in Israel. Even the people who own the land can't even sustain themselves. It's too weak. Yeah. Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, so this is what Rabbi Yitzchak said. We couldn't figure out all the names. We only found out that we figured out this one. Rabbi Yochanan says, Af anu neimar, we can also add to this list another name that we can deduce what it might mean. Namely, that name is Nachbi ben Vavsi. Nachbi ben Vavsi says, oh, I don't know which tribe it is because there's no little footnote in the side. Does the Steindel tell you which tribe it is? No? Nachbi ben Vavsi doesn't say which tribe. Okay. So what's the name Nachbi ben Vavsi? Because the word Nachbi, the name Nachbi comes from the word hidden. He concealed the words of God. And his father named Vavsi. The word Vavsi, the name Vavsi has the letters Fe, Samach, Yud, which comes from the term to skip over. Pasa. He jumped over the attributes of God. God said we can do it, and he jumped over that. So I want to just indicate something interesting. Just all these four names, Sater to contradict, Michael to become weak, Nachbi to conceal, and Pesi, Vavsi to jump over. All of those four can either be in the positive or the negative. They can all be in the positive or the negative. We could have easily seen a scenario in which the contradiction is not that he contradicted to Hashem, but he contradicted his inner inclination for negative. Made himself, sorry? Exactly. Mach, he made himself weak. Not weak because he made himself weak that he can't, but he's incapable of getting things done. But he made himself humble. That could have been something we could have seen. Concealed. Not he made God concealed, but he was humble, made himself concealed. When he describes someone who's very concealed, the expression is nichba lakelim. It's an expression using the word nichba to conceal. He conceals himself, doesn't want not a show off. And Pisa Medosav, he jumps over God's attributes. Could be he jumps over his own attitudes, gets over his own preconceived ideas. So all of these names are only negative in context, not inherently. Even this is my reading in the Gemara. Now, sometimes we have names where like the name itself indicates negative. Whereas here it's like only negative if you apply, it's like, it's an adjective. It depends what you put after it,
It's sort of like a dream if you give it wings.
Exactly.
If you interpret it can manifest.
That's right.
They had an inclination to have these attitudes.
That's right.
But it depends if they actually put them into force.
Yeah. So it comes back to the free choice issue. Your free choice comes along with the cards you're dealt. You're dealt a certain character. You're dealt a certain disposition, a certain personality. Now you can decide what you want to do with that personality. You can either decide, like Yeshua and Kalev in a minute, as we'll see, to get power from the tzaddik and that way overcome. Or you can decide from the beginning, it's we're going to shame this whole thing because it's a waste of time and that's the end of it. And then all the personality gets used in the negative. Because there's no character that is inherently evil. It's just a question of how it's used. When Rambam describes proper character, the only character he says to be extremely far away from is arrogance. But even arrogance, if you redirect it and douse with the heavy dose of humility, is also important. Go'in Yaakov, pride of being Jewish, not to bow down to what's the word, to social pressure, or to peer pressure, or to popular culture. No, to stand strong. But like it says about Mordechai, he didn't bow down because he was Yehudi. He only bows down to Hashem. That pride is also something that can be channeled in the positive. So there are no characters in themselves that are absolutely evil. It's just a question of how they're used. And I think the same thing is true of all four of the ones we're describing here. They decided to use it in the negative, as Rish Lakish said earlier. To begin with, they were looking for the embarrassment. So of course they're going to fail. If to begin with, you start off thinking that's all going to be bad. And if you think the whole thing's going to be bad, then obviously all your character's going to come out in that failure. But if to begin with, as we'll learn tomorrow, how Yeshua and Kalev draw strength from the tzaddik, and all the positivity, all their character gets used in a positive way to overcome and indeed overcome all the challenges.
Does it discuss their names and how they're made?
Yeshua and Kalev. Yeshua's name is discussed. Certainly, I don't think Kalev's name is discussed. Maybe much later if I didn't get that far ahead. But maybe Kalev's name is discussed. But Yeshua is definitely discussed, but I don't think Kalev is discussed. Maybe much later. I haven't got that far. Okay. Tomorrow we'll dig into Yeshua and Kalev and how they avoided the mistakes of the spies. And as I already alluded to, they draw strength from the tzaddik. So that, God willing, coming tomorrow.
I think one of them went to visit the graves of...
That's correct. We'll learn that tomorrow. Okay, have a wonderful day.
Bye.